Our story today shook the quiet town of Quincy, Illinois to its core. It's a tale of love turned to hate, of suspicions that destroyed lives, and of the search for justice in a labyrinth of evidence and conflicting testimony. Sit back as I tell you about the tragic events surrounding the death of Becky Bliefnick, a woman whose life was cut far too short in a brutal way. Quincy, Illinois, is a city of about 40,000 residents, picturesquely situated on the banks of the mighty Mississippi. It's a place where people feel safe, where many still leave their doors unlocked, and where violent crime is rare. But on February 23, 2023, this idyllic setting was shattered in the most cruel way. It was a cold winter day when investigators were called to a crime scene unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. One seasoned investigator, who wishes to remain anonymous, recalls with audible distress in his voice, "This was different from any murder we've ever had. This was a murder that happened in someone's bathroom. From the first moment we entered the house and saw Becky's body, we knew this wasn't an ordinary case." The brutality of the crime was shocking and made even hardened police officers shudder. Becky had been shot 14 times, with another shot missing its target. In total, 15 shots were fired. The scene in the bathroom resembled a battlefield, walls spattered with blood, and the victim's body lying in a grotesque position on the cold tile floor. News of Becky's death spread like wildfire through the small town. Families locked their doors, parents called their children in from the streets, and an atmosphere of fear settled over Quincy. Who could be capable of such a brutal act? Was it a stranger who had come to town, or, even more frightening, someone from within their midst? Sarah Riley, Becky's older sister, received a call that would forever change her life. She was on vacation, far from the tragic events unfolding in Quincy. With tears choking her voice, she remembers, "My mother called me. She was understandably hysterical and kept repeating, 'Becky is dead.' You never expect a call telling you your sister is dead. It doesn't seem possible." Sarah and her husband Brett were enjoying a relaxing day at the beach when the call came. In one moment, they were carefree and happy. In the next, their world was turned upside down. Sarah recalls the surreal situation. "It was as if the sun had suddenly gone out. I couldn't comprehend what my mother was telling me. Becky, my little sister, dead? It had to be a terrible mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. Becky Bliefnick, 41 years old, nurse and mother of 3, had been brutally murdered. Sarah and Brett now faced the difficult task of getting to Quincy as quickly as possible. Sarah remembers the frantic hours after the call. "It was like a nightmare. How quickly can we get to the airport, fly back to New York, unpack our swimsuits and pack funeral clothes, and get to Quincy, Illinois?" The journey was torture, with every minute seeming like an eternity. Sarah describes her feelings during the flight. "We held each other, crying and screaming in grief. I couldn't stop thinking about Becky, about our last conversation, about all the things I still wanted to tell her." Becky wasn't just another victim of a senseless crime. She was a beloved daughter, sister, friend, and above all, a devoted mother. Sarah describes her sister with tears in her eyes. "She was an incredible nurse, but she was meant to be a mother. I can't imagine how anyone could look at such a beautiful and kind person and still think they should take her life. She must have been so scared." Becky's life was defined by compassion and care. As a nurse, she had stood by countless people in their darkest hours. Her colleagues described her as dedicated, competent, and always wearing a smile. One colleague remembers, Becky was the sunshine of our unit. No matter how stressful the day was, she always had an encouraging word for patients and colleagues alike. But Becky's true passion was her 3 sons. At ages 12, 10, and 5, they were the center of her life. Sarah lovingly remembers, "Becky was amazing as an aunt, but as a mother, she was unmatched. She lived for those boys. Every free minute was spent playing with them, reading to them, or driving them to their activities." The brutal crime shook the community of Quincy to its core. A city that had felt safe was suddenly confronted with the harsh reality that evil can lurk anywhere. A local official explains the impact. "This brutal crime has thrown the Quincy community into turmoil, and our residents are living in fear." The question everyone asked was, how could something like this happen in their small, peaceful town? Quincy, with its picturesque location on the Mississippi, its historic buildings and tight-knit community, seemed the most unlikely place for such a brutal crime. The investigators immediately began their work. They searched the house for evidence and questioned neighbors. Every inch of the crime scene was meticulously examined. Even the smallest detail could be the key to solving the case. Soon it was discovered that the killer had broken into Becky's house by prying open a window on the upper floor. It was a window in one of the children's rooms, a fact that made the case even more disturbing. The thought that someone had entered through a child's room to kill their mother made even experienced investigators shudder. A video later released by the police shows an officer reenacting how the perpetrator likely entered the house. The investigator explains with a serious expression, "The person climbed up there. There was a patio chair that had been pulled over. They went past Becky's windows in her bedroom, and then they went to one of the boys' rooms and broke open the window. Went inside." The reconstruction of the crime was chilling and left many questions unanswered. Why had the perpetrator chosen such a complicated way to enter the house? Was it someone who knew the house and its occupants? The investigator continues, "You could almost track their path to Becky's room. They had forcibly kicked in or broken down the door. Becky then ran into the bathroom, turned around, and was shot." The exact timeline of the crime was quickly established, thanks to modern technology and Becky's desperate attempt to call for help. The intruder entered the house at about 1:11 in the morning. The investigator explains, "We know this because at 1:11 and 10 seconds, Becky tried to dial 911 on her cell phone. She dialed 91126 before the phone was knocked from her hand. It was found later behind the door." This information was a crucial lead for investigators. It not only showed the exact time of the attack, but also that Becky was aware of the danger and desperately tried to get help. The final seconds of her life must have been filled with unimaginable fear. Although nothing appeared to be stolen and neighbors neither saw nor heard anything, the killer left traces. Investigators found a partial shoe print near the point of entry, 8 fired 9mm shell casings, and small pieces of plastic on the floor around Becky's body. This evidence was both puzzling and fascinating. The shoe print could lead to identifying the perpetrator if they found the matching shoe. The shell casings provided information about the weapon used. But the plastic pieces were particularly interesting. One investigator remembers, "We thought it was unusual when we saw that. It was like, okay, what is this?" The plastic pieces would later prove to be crucial evidence, but at this point, they were just another puzzle in a case full of questions. Hoping to find more evidence, detectives canvassed the neighborhood looking for surveillance videos. In our modern world, surveillance cameras are ubiquitous, and investigators hoped that one of these cameras might have caught the perpetrator. They didn't have to go far. Becky's neighbors, the Hymans, had installed a camera on the side of their house after a car break-in more than a year earlier. The camera was pointed at their driveway, which ran along Becky's house. The Hymans explained their camera's functionality to investigators. It records motion. Every time it detects movement, it notifies us on our phones. This type of technology has become a common security measure in many neighborhoods, often more for deterring package thieves than solving murders. Although the Hymans' camera hadn't recorded anything on the night of the murder, it had captured something unusual about 24 hours earlier. Investigators spent hours analyzing the footage, hoping to find a clue to the killer's identity. They slowed down some of the videos for better viewing. At 1:05 in the morning, a person could be seen walking down the driveway toward the back of Becky's house. What appeared to be the same person was seen again 48 minutes later, this time walking in the opposite direction. These recordings were fascinating but frustrating. The person was only visible as a dark silhouette, with no facial features or other identifying characteristics visible. Was this the murderer scouting the property, or just a random nighttime walker? The camera had also captured a similar incident about a week earlier, on Valentine's Day. This fact added another eerie dimension to the case. Had the killer been lurking around the house weeks before the crime? One of the neighbors, who wishes to remain anonymous, recalls, "I saw this in the middle of the night and immediately sent Becky a message. I told her we had just seen someone in the driveway." This neighbor had instinctively sensed something was wrong and tried to warn Becky. Becky didn't respond until the next morning, likely because she had been sleeping. When she did respond, she told her neighbor something disturbing. The neighbor remembers. She said that, while she hadn't seen anything, she thought she'd heard voices in her backyard. Her motion detectors had gone off, and she was very paranoid at that time. This information was alarming. Had Becky sensed impending danger in the weeks before her death? Had she tried to ignore or downplay her fears? Investigators wondered if Becky might have known more than she admitted. The Hymans initially thought it was a neighborhood burglar looking for something to steal. In a town like Quincy, while petty thefts and break-ins are rare, they do occur. But now, with Becky dead, they began to wonder. And so did investigators. Had what they thought was a harmless burglar actually been a killer watching his victim? The police searched the entire neighborhood for more videos. Every neighbor was questioned. Every surveillance camera checked. An investigator reports, "We were able to find video from one house, and we were able to find video from the Quincy bus depot. These videos showed a person riding a bicycle toward Becky's house." These new videos added more pieces to the puzzle. A person riding a bicycle through the streets of Quincy at night was unusual enough to attract attention. But was it the same person who had been seen in Becky's driveway? After analyzing the recorded times of the videos, authorities began to suspect that the person on the bicycle was indeed the same person seen in the driveway. An investigator explains, "Every time you see a person at the Hyman house, you see a person riding a bicycle down the street just minutes before you see a person on that Hyman video." This correlation was too strong to be coincidence. It seemed someone was systematically scouting the area around Becky's house, perhaps looking for the best time to attack. Although there was no video from the Hymans on the morning of Becky's murder, there was video of a person on a bicycle riding toward Becky's house shortly before the murder, and in the opposite direction shortly after. An investigator notes, "And this isn't a part of town where people ride bikes in the middle of the night in winter. So when you have this surveillance video, and it matches the timeline exactly, that's suspicious." The fact that someone was riding a bicycle on a cold winter night was unusual in itself. That this person was seen near Becky's house exactly when the murder took place made it even more suspicious. Investigators began to believe they might have footage of the killer en route to and from the crime scene. But there was a major problem with this video evidence. A frustrated investigator admits, "You can't make out anything from the videos, except that the bicycle apparently had no reflectors on the wheels. I mean, you can't tell if it's male or female. It's terrible. The video is terrible." The poor quality of the footage was a major obstacle for investigators. They had evidence that someone was prowling around Becky's house at night, but they couldn't identify this person. The lack of reflectors on the bicycle wheels was an interesting detail, but it wasn't enough to convict someone. The authorities needed more leads, and they would get one from an unexpected source: Becky's sister, Sarah. This information would steer the investigation in a very specific direction and turn the case on its head. When Becky's sister, Sarah, and her brother-in-law, Brett, learned of her murder, they say they immediately thought of one person as the prime suspect: Becky's estranged husband, Tim Bliefnick. Sarah remembers with a mixture of grief and anger. "I immediately told Brett it was Tim. Instantly." This accusation was serious and would dramatically change the course of the investigation. Police now had to consider not just a possible stranger, but someone who had been very close to Becky. Or at least had been at one time. To understand why Sarah so quickly pointed to Tim as a suspect, we need to go back in time and examine the story of Becky and Tim from the beginning. Tim and Becky had met when they were students at Quincy University. Quincy University is a small, private liberal arts college, known for its tight-knit community and family atmosphere. It's a place where many lifelong friendships and relationships begin. Interestingly, Tim and Becky didn't start dating until 2 years after graduation. Perhaps they had lost touch during their college years and reconnected later. Or maybe it took that time for their friendship to develop into something deeper. When asked how she would describe Becky during this time, Sarah responds with a wistful smile. Happy, fun. She was beautiful. In Sarah's memory, this was a time of hope and optimism for her sister. Becky was starting her career, in love, and full of plans for the future. The relationship between Tim and Becky progressed quickly. They eventually moved in together, married, and started a family. It seemed they had found the American dream: a happy marriage, a growing family, and successful careers. Becky, who had previously worked in pharmaceutical sales, made the decision to give up her career to become a full-time mother. This is a choice many women make, often with mixed feelings. For Becky, however, it seemed to be the right choice. Her friends and family describe her as a woman who flourished in her role as a mother. Meanwhile, Tim continued his successful career in the recycling industry. The recycling industry has gained importance in recent years as environmental awareness grows. Tim's work in this field suggested he might have been environmentally conscious and forward-thinking. Tim recalls this time with a mixture of nostalgia and regret. "I thought that was it. I thought I'd be 85 years old, sitting in a rocking chair on the porch with her, talking about how good life was." This statement shows that Tim, at least early in their marriage, was optimistic about their future and envisioned a long, happy life with Becky. But as often happens in life, things didn't develop as the couple had hoped. What began as a love story would transform into something much darker. Shannon Zanger, a close friend of Becky's, provides insight into the marriage's evolution. She was very happy in the first 5 years of their marriage. And then, things started to change. He became more aggressively manipulative and controlling, and he never did any work around the house. This statement is revealing. It indicates that the problems in the marriage didn't exist from the beginning, but developed over time. The first 5 years seem to have been happy, which raises the question of what changed afterward. Was it the stress of a growing family? Financial problems? Or did Tim and Becky simply grow in different directions? Shannon recalls conversations with Becky that shed light on the dynamics in the marriage. When she would come over and we'd talk about our husbands, as women do, she felt like she was carrying the bulk of the burden. I thought, man, I really have a partner. And she didn't seem to have that partnership. This statement shows that Becky possibly felt overwhelmed and unsupported. In a marriage, especially when children are involved, it's important for both partners to contribute. When one feels they're carrying the entire burden, it can lead to resentment and conflict. Shannon and Sarah say the relationship became even more strained when Becky decided to go back to school to become a nurse. This decision was likely not easy for Becky. Going back to school as a mother of 3 requires a lot of determination and hard work. Sarah explains Tim's reaction to Becky's decision. He not only didn't support her, but he also didn't increase his time with the boys. This statement suggests that Tim was unwilling to take on more responsibility at home to support Becky's new career goals. Tim has a different view of the situation. While he admits he wasn't in favor of Becky pursuing a nursing career, he says it was out of concern for her well-being. Because of the stress factor, he explains. This could mean that Tim was worried Becky would be overwhelmed by the dual burden of family and career. When asked if he was concerned about having to take on more work with the children, Tim responds, "Not at all. I was always involved with the kids every day." This statement contradicts what Becky's friends and family report. It shows there were possibly different perceptions of how much each partner contributed to child care and household duties. The tensions in the marriage eventually reached a point where separation seemed inevitable. In January 2021, after 11 years of marriage, Tim filed for divorce. This was a pivotal moment in Tim and Becky's story, a moment that possibly paved the way for the tragedy that would follow. Tim was reluctant to discuss the exact reasons for filing for divorce. This is not unusual in such situations, as divorces are often complex and emotionally charged. Although he didn't want to discuss the details, he indicated it had to do with what he saw as a change in Becky's personality after she became a nurse. He explains, "She had major issues with patience and stress, especially when it came to the kids, and that created some conflicts." This statement suggests Tim believed Becky's new career had negatively impacted their family life. It's a challenge many working parents know, finding the balance between work and family. But Sarah, Becky's sister, has a different view of the situation. She says Tim is just making excuses. In Sarah's eyes, the real reason for Tim's decision to file for divorce was that he couldn't control Becky. This statement casts a disturbing light on the dynamics in the marriage and hints at possible issues with control and power. The divorce proceedings quickly became contentious. Court records show that both parties filed numerous motions and counter-motions. What could have been a straightforward legal process turned into a bitter battle that would drag on for more than 2 years. One particularly telling incident occurred during a court-mandated couples therapy session. The therapist asked both Tim and Becky to complete the sentence, "If I really knew you, I would know." Becky's response was chilling. She wrote, "If you really knew me, you would know that I'm scared of you." This response raises serious questions. What had happened in the marriage to make Becky afraid of Tim? Was this fear justified, or was it a product of the increasingly hostile divorce proceedings? The situation became even more complicated when Tim appeared on the television game show Family Feud in September 2022. During the show, host Steve Harvey asked Tim what his biggest mistake at his wedding was. Tim's response, "I do." The audience laughed, but given what would happen later, this joke takes on a much darker meaning. Sarah remembers watching the episode with horror. When I saw that, I felt sick to my stomach. It wasn't funny. It was cruel. The Family Feud incident became a turning point in how many people viewed Tim. What might have seemed like harmless humor to some appeared to others as a public display of contempt for his marriage to Becky. In the months following this incident, the divorce proceedings became increasingly hostile. Court documents reveal a pattern of escalating tensions. Tim and Becky couldn't agree on custody arrangements, financial matters, or even basic communication protocols regarding their children. By early 2023, the situation had deteriorated significantly. Becky had obtained a restraining order against Tim, citing concerns for her safety. In court documents, she detailed what she described as threatening behavior and intimidation tactics. A friend of Becky's, who wishes to remain anonymous, recalls a conversation from this period. She told me she was afraid something might happen to her. She said if anything ever happened to her, we should look at Tim. This statement would later prove prophetic in the most tragic way possible. Then came February 23rd, 2023. The day started like any other. Becky got her children ready for school, went to work at the hospital, and returned home in the evening. She followed her usual routine, unaware that it would be her last. The next morning, when Becky didn't show up for work, her colleagues became concerned. It wasn't like her to miss work without calling. They tried reaching her by phone, but there was no response. Finally, someone went to check on her. What they found would shock the entire community. Becky lay dead in her bathroom, having been shot multiple times. The violent nature of the crime suggested this wasn't a random act, but something personal, something filled with rage. The investigation moved quickly after Becky's body was discovered. Within hours, police had secured the crime scene and begun collecting evidence. The plastic pieces found near Becky's body would prove crucial to the investigation. These pieces, investigators discovered, came from a Taurus 9mm handgun. This particular model was known to have a design flaw that caused the grip to crack and shed small plastic pieces when fired repeatedly. This detail would become significant later in the investigation. On March 13, 2023, just weeks after Becky's murder, police arrested Tim Bliefnick. The arrest wasn't based on a single piece of evidence, but on what investigators described as a tapestry of evidence that all pointed to Tim. The evidence included surveillance footage showing someone on a bicycle near Becky's house, the plastic pieces matching a specific type of handgun, Tim's documented history of conflict with Becky, cell phone location data, DNA evidence found at the scene. When confronted with the evidence, Tim maintained his innocence. His attorney stated, "Mr. Bliefnick categorically denies these charges. We intend to defend him vigorously in court." The trial began on May 15, 2023. Over 10 days, prosecutors presented their case, methodically laying out the evidence against Tim. The prosecution's theory was that Tim had carefully planned the murder, conducting surveillance of Becky's house, and choosing a time when the children would be away. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was Tim's internet search history. In the weeks before the murder, he had searched for information about breaking into houses, picking locks, and defeating home security systems. He had also searched for information about untraceable guns. The prosecution also presented evidence that Tim had purchased a bicycle similar to the one seen in surveillance footage, though the bicycle was never found. They showed that he had bought a Taurus 9mm handgun through a private sale, which explained why there was no record of the purchase. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there were other possible suspects who weren't properly investigated. They pointed out that no murder weapon was ever found, and that the surveillance footage was too grainy to positively identify anyone. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. On August 7, 2023, Tim was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Becky's children are being raised by her sister, Sarah. The community of Quincy continues to grapple with this tragedy, and domestic violence awareness has become a major focus in the area. Becky's story serves as a stark reminder of how domestic disputes can escalate to deadly violence,